So it's a great pleasure to have Joanne Sheehan with us today. And thank you, Dupre, for insisting that you come and speak to us. Joanne has been an organizer and nonviolence trainer and educator with the War Resisters League since the 1970s and is founder and staff of the New England Regional Office of the WRL since 1985. Joanne has been active with the War Resisters League since 1983, serving as chair from 1998 to 2006. She is editor and contributor of the Handbook for Nonviolent Campaigns, and she provides resources and support in a number of wonderful areas, including nonviolence training and the preparation of nonviolent direct action, and in what I love, Voluntown Peace Trust. I love Voluntown, the town of volunteers, the Volunteer Peace Trust, and this one, the Pacifist Catering. Joanne also helped publish The New Worlds in Old Shells, and there are other books that are for sale on the back. So can we please welcome Joanne here to speak to us today on sharing the legacy of peacebuilding in precarious times. Come on up, dear. Thank you.
Should have sat for that introduction so you didn't have to see my face. All right, I am, oh, good Lord, sorry. That's not mine, that's fine. I'm really happy to be here. Yes, I want to give a special shout out to Dupre, who I am, as founder said, a caterer for People's Music Network. And there's a number of you here today, which is great. And I brought this WRL history exhibit, which we did a couple of years ago on our 100th anniversary, to a People's Music Network event, to a weekend gathering, in hopes that folks would make this connection and do exactly this. And a few other folks have, but mostly, it's been, I think that was over a year, so I thank Dupre for her consistency, good movement values and just keeping it going and getting it here. So I'm really glad to be here, sharing a few words and also making sure that we have time to have some discussion as well. It was, Vandra picked the David little video there, and I mean, I worked with David from 1970 on. He was both a mentor and somebody I had a lot of arguments and discussions with around a number of issues. But he's pretty solid and really taught me a whole lot of things. I think, and I've seen this film before, but I think, and this is the kind of the horrors of war is that as I was watching the video, we were looking at Germany, but it looked like we were looking at Gaza. It's never ending, as Phil Oakes, that was such an appropriate song for the beginning here and for this exploration. There are a number of reasons that I did pick these quotes. I want to start off a little bit with that to kind of maybe set the stage here. So that, as many of you probably know, is Martin Luther King at the Riverside Church speech that he gave against the war in Vietnam. And to me, I think one of the things that's most important about that is not only the analysis that he gives in that speech, which is so important because so often we don't hear enough of but the analysis that connects the issues, really looking at racism, which is what he was known for, connecting it with poverty, which was very clear, but also with militarism and with those levels of violence, and making that connection, which, for those who know, he got a lot of trouble for that. He was not liked for making those connections. And there was a lot of argument that if you go away from just looking at kind of what you do in the civil rights movement, you will lose support, because of course there is so often support for war. But I think that so much of the wisdom out of that I take out of that is also him talking about in there that revolutionary spirit is revolutionary nonviolence, and saying we have a choice today between nonviolence or non-existence. I was thinking of that in terms of, for now, in terms of, clearly part of the non-existence is the non-existence through nuclear weapons, that we have the non-existence through the climate crisis, but also the non-existence of democracy in our country, the non-existence of kind of freedoms and liberties around the world. So that it's a really very universal kind of a quote. And for those who haven't heard it for a while or haven't heard it at all, it's all over the internet. It's easy to find. I also chose the quote from Barbara because she was a personal inspiration for me. I read, as a few of the other folks here may have, I read her stuff hot off the mimeograph machine at 339 Lafayette Street, literally, right? She was very close to War Resisters League. Also, the connection with Voluntown and Barbara is that Barbara was a writer. She was not an activist. She was just beginning to kind of look at some issues. She did go to India. She did interview Fidel for The Nation magazine. And someone gave her sent her a Liberation magazine to say that you might be interested, because there was an article about Cuba in there, but you might be interested. There's a 16-day nonviolence training happening in New London, Connecticut, as part of Polaris Action Summer 1960. Maybe you want to write about it. And she wrote about it in The Nation later. And it's the second essay in Revolution and Equilibrium. She says, I didn't know who any of those people were. I didn't think I'd be the least impressed, but I thought I could at least get an article out of it. She took the train up to New London, got off right by City Pier. You can see Electric Boat, builder of at that point, Polaris submarines. And she stayed for 16 days. It changed her life, and I think it changed ours in a whole lot of ways, right? She connected the work against the arms race and the work against racism. She went on the Southern Walk for Peace and kind of connected these issues, and nonviolence became just such an important foundation for her, and then really went on to do groundbreaking work in terms of feminism and nonviolence at a time when a lot of women were saying, I can't be a feminist, that's about turning the other cheek and giving in, and where it is clearly not. But there's so much of a kind of sense of that Barbara really helped us break through in so many ways. I think also that quote, which isn't a quote I usually use. I use the quote of Barbara in terms of her talking about two hands, right? We're reaching out and recognizing someone's humanity while we try to stop them at the same time. But here, really looking at this idea of really dismantling the oppressive systems and resisting that, and not just going after kind of the bad behavior of the opposition. And right now we have a lot of bad behavior. It's, you can make a lot of fun of this, the orange man in the White House kind of stuff. That is not what is going to change the system. That's the easy stuff, right? That's the low-lying fruit that we too often see in the signs and some of the images in some of the big demonstrations. So I think kind of trying to remember that we are really looking at it is the oppressive systems that we need to resist, name, and dismantle. And then I wanted a younger activist, looking at Greta's work, who in her quote is really calling us out and calling out and working for calling us out and working for system change, in many ways. And while she's mostly known as a climate protection activist, and someone who came out against the war in, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Most recently, we know her as one of the highest profile people on the Freedom Flotilla, one of the people who was arrested by the IDF in attempting to bring desperately needed supplies to Gaza. So I think that all three of these people really spoke to and acted on, and with Greta continue to act on, seeing this war and these violence so interconnected. And when we silo things, it's easy for us to get picked off. It's easy for people to feel overwhelmed. What will I do? What will I do? Rather than saying, I do what I need to do, I'll do what my passion is, but I need to make sure these are not in a silo. So while we're focusing today on peace building, and clearly, as somebody who works with a group called the War Resisters League, we do anti-war work, but War Resisters League has always stated that war is a crime against humanity, and while we won't participate in a war of any kind, that we work to stop war and the causes of war, and that needs to be always seen as, and what are those causes of war, and that is the inconvenient truth in many ways. I was really happy to hear, or not happy, but it struck me how many times the word lies came up in the quotes and in the songs already today, and I think that's something that kind of a theme here that I have. And some of it's lies, some of it's omission, some of it's kind of denial, right? So a few weeks ago, a college friend of mine posted a story on Facebook about a nurse who had served in Vietnam during the war there, and it was just in heartbreaking detail what she went through in the hospital there, and what she went through in trying to patch people up in terms of holding people while they were dying, and all the trauma she witnessed, and how since then she's lived with PTSD. She also has lived with the effects of Agent Orange. And the story was about her bravery and about her as a woman and how women were not seen as being in that, right? You think of PTSD, you think of a soldier. They weren't looking really at the mental and physical effects of how that was on women, and that we should really focus on that. There's no question in these stories, though, about why that was happening. The context is never really examined or listened. So anyone of any political persuasion, sorry, I talk with my hands, obviously, could look at that and say, oh, of course she was brave. Of course she did what she felt she had to do. But at what point do we say, but let's question what this is. Let's try and understand, why do we put these people, whether that be the soldier or the nurse, in situations that damage the rest of their lives and damage people, and people are still dying of Agent Orange in Vietnam, just like people are dying of radiation poisoning in Japan. It never ends. The other place I saw that this week happening, and some of you might have seen the congressional hearing where Kristi Noem went, and Representative Magaziner from Rhode Island questioned her, and he was quite good. He was quite dramatic. This is not somebody I think has a high profile. He's right. I live right next door to Rhode Island. But so he basically brought forth 3 veterans who were deeply affected by deportation, and by either them or in one case, their spouse being detained or being deported, right? And so the first story in particular was striking. It was a man who was on the screen, who had been born in Korea, came over when he was 7, went into the Army, was in Panama, was shot in the leg twice, just the horrors of war. And as a result of that, had PTSD, struggled with substance abuse, and had been arrested many years ago, I guess maybe 15 years ago or whatever, on minor drug charges, is what they said, and has been deported because he broke the law, because they sent him back, and he's in a country he hasn't lived in 7 years. Representative Magaziner asked Kristi Noem to thank him for his service, which she dutifully did. But again, there is no recognition of the horrors of the situation we put this person in. And that went through the whole thing. Kristi Noem was forced to say, thank you for your service. And it is something that we do without thinking, that we even call it a service to our country, that we believe that it is protection, that I think even those of us in the peace movement too often sometimes fall into holding up these myths or these lies without kind of interrupting that and saying, and I think I'm thankful for War Resisters League because we do those things. We don't call it the armed services, we call it the armed forces. Just call it what it is and begin to lay out more what that is. And obviously, war is protected. That's part of the problem here, right? War is protected. It's patriotic, it's called service. We're told to stand at sports games. We're told, that this is the highest level that you could achieve. But yet it's a myth. And that is, as we look at nonviolence, and not to say there's something wrong with those people, it's to say there's a system that puts people into that. I'll talk a little more about that, in the next 10, 15 minutes. So I want to refer a little bit to these panels, and I'm sorry, I know that people on Zoom can't see all of them. Hopefully there's some way that people can take a look at them. Because I do want to kind of get back to this kind of war and kind of what we think of as war, how we as War Resisters League began that process. So on the very first panel, which I don't think any of us can see because it faces the door, but you can take a look at that later. Our founder, Jessie Wallace Hewen, has a quote on that. She says, "A war is not like an earthquake or a tornado. It's an act of men and women. Wars will cease when men, and now women, refuse to fight. Do not allow people to lead you to think for a moment that war is a necessary institution." WRL, and there's a lot of connections to Brooklyn here with War Resisters League. WRL was founded by Jessie Wallace Hewen and her friend Tracy Mygett when they came to Brooklyn to have dinner with the Howells. They had formed the Anti-Establishment League in 1915, and post-World War I started the War Resisters League, a league for pacifists. And since then, we've had the same declaration that war is a crime against humanity. And I knew you would be here, thank goodness, Cara. And the very first War Resisters League staff person was Cara's great uncle, Abe Kaufman. And so he's out there on that wall too. So everybody, we can take a picture of Cara next to Abe. But the first time Cara saw me in the WRL t-shirt, she said, WRL? Before she could even say Ida is my aunt, I said, Ida? Because we do honor our elders. We do honor the ancestors. We do really kind of see the importance of their involvement. And we do recognize, and I think one of the things that this history and the time that this history has come out now is recognizing the importance of what's come before us, and that too often there's so many people who don't know what these struggles were, don't have a clue about the kind of underlying things, or that this is not the first time, or I do too many trainings, we say, it's never been this bad. It's like, okay. Too many white upper middle class folks, bemoaning because they've finally woken up. A lot of you, probably half the room here, know Charlie King because we got People's Music Network here, folks, and my friends Pat and SJ are here, and we've gone back since the 1970s together doing a lot of work. So when Charlie and I and a group of us lived in New York City together. Charlie's song, vaguely reminiscent of the 60s, is one of my kind of favorites there. And I remember him writing it when we lived at Fallontown, which was then called the Community for Nonviolent Action. And the local reporter came over and said, well, you people are vague. It was 1977, 78. You people are vaguely reminiscent of the 60s. It's kind of how they, what are you doing? Like, oh, yeah, didn't you people used to do this kind of thing? I remember back in the Precarious action days, right? But one of my favorite lines in that song is when he sings about labor organizing being vaguely reminiscent of the 30s, right? That we need to go back to that understanding that we are standing on a lot of shoulders, that it's cyclical. Yes, there was World War II and we have Gaza, but that we have that we can understand better how change happens. The arc of justice is very long. There are a lot of really hard things to do within this. but that we need to learn from the stories and the strategies of people who have done that. And I think that really does help me, you know, and I do nonviolence trainings, and, you know, I'll ask classrooms of people, sometimes of every age, but mostly the young, you know, what do you know of the civil rights movement? You know, what do you think they say? Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. Now, a lot of classrooms can't get past that. They cannot tell you the tens of thousands of people who are involved, or name any other names at all, right? And if that's what you understand is social change, then you're not going to be able to create social change. Because if we don't understand that it's about campaign building, it's about real collective actions, you know, supporting individual actions, but also really building people power, then we're not going to be able to address the issues of war and the causes of war. I want to point out a few of these stories that I think a lot of times people don't know of. And one over here, I don't know, maybe it's the second or third panel, has a picture of the people in the journey of reconciliation. And people know what the journey of reconciliation is, a few of you, but not everybody here. So in 1940, there were a couple of ministers who were kicked out of India for supporting Gandhi, and who came back and helped start the Harlem Ashram on 5th Avenue and 125th Street. The Harlem Ashram became a place where folks who were black folks who were looking at Gandhi and looking at what was happening and saying, could this method help us in some ways? It was also peopled by folks who were pacifists like Bayard Rustin and Jim Peck, who were people who had, you know, were clearly opposed to war and violence, and who were also looking at the development of nonviolence. And James Farmer, who actually Congress of Racial Equality started in 1942 out of what was being learned and discussed at the Harlem Ashram. And actually, I think Cara and I have had this conversation, it changed war resisters in a way because it made people say, is this for us or not? Is this war resistance or, and people, and kind of the group of folks that went on said, yes, this is our opposition to violence and war and causes of war. This is a struggle we need to engage in. So many people who were part of that group ended up spending time in either prison or conscientious objector camps during World War II. And then when they came out, decided that they were going to try to use nonviolence to ride together as black and white men on buses in the northern part of the southern states. Sound like the Freedom Rides, but it's decades before what we know as the Freedom Rides were 1961. I'm talking about 1947. So half of them were black men, half of them were white men. Ella Baker and Juanita Nelson really argued that women needed to be on these rides, and it was too dangerous for the women, they were told. And so, which is ironic because the Freedom Rides were then started by Diane Nash and women who had been part of the Nashville campaign, the Nashville Lunch Counter Sit-In campaign. So that was George Hauser from who's with Fellowship of Reconciliation and Bayard, organized the first nonviolence training, prepared those 16 people to what they were going to face, and it began to use what they had learned about Gandhi and what Gandhi had done in India, and some of the methods of nonviolence training that were being developed here, and prepared folks for that action. And you know, when we think, oh, it's never been this bad, I mean, they were dragged out of buses. Both Bayard and Igor Rudenko, who some of you might know from 339 Lafayette Street, were sentenced to chain gangs. Bayard got 22 days. Egal, who was a white Jew from New York, as the judge said, got 30 because he should have known better. That's what the judge said to Egal. So some of the things that I learned my early years at 339, listening to David McReynolds and Egal Rudenko telling stories about Bayard, and Egal telling stories about his own time on a chain gang. So, and if we see how them and the work they did, and so much of so many, I mean, you could do a whole 2-hour talk on just the people who were on that and what they went on to do in the civil rights movement. Wally Nelson, one of the founders of war tax resistance movement, those folks and kind of the work that they did. And how they have then obviously inspired other activists, and particularly the Nashville activists, who then went on to do the freedom rides. I think that's also important in looking at those stories and the strategies, because what we see is this combination of nonviolent direct action and court action helping, right? So that you've got that grassroots, and I think we see that now, right? And people say, oh, good, the elections, they're all going for our side, so that's kind of our hope. And it's like, they wouldn't be doing anything if it wasn't for us being in the streets, standing in front of ICE, doing these kinds of things. That is really, that grassroots activism is really what has to keep happening. A couple of other stories up here. One is the Golden Rule, the sailing of the Golden Rule. I know the Golden Rule was here in New York a couple of Junes ago, and they did a great loop. The Golden Rule was a boat that a number of pacifists bought and fixed up and tried to sail into the areas where atmospheric nuclear testing was being done in the late 50s. And a number of people, they made it to Hawaii. The government suddenly made it illegal for people to do what they were trying to do. They were jailed in Hawaii a number of times. George Willoughby, Jim Peck, a number of again, folks who were some World War II activists, some longtime Quaker nonviolent activists and the like. And that story alone was what inspired Greenpeace to exist, and what has inspired like the Freedom Flotilla and other things. So that when activists learn of what other activists are doing. It's also interesting to see that when that happened, I went back and I read all the War Resisters League Executive Committee minutes, because Bayard Rustin did the fundraising for it and did a lot of the promotion for it. He was on staff at War Resisters League at the time. The amount of work that went into, I mean, you had to buy a boat to get people out there. They were trained, but also the fact that by the late 50s, even as they'd gone through the McCarthy area, they had so many international connections that they were inspired by somebody who had tried to do this from the UK. And they were able to have demonstrations of support within 3 days. They didn't have email, they didn't have WhatsApp, right? That they had made enough personal connections through groups like War Resisters International, International Fellowship of Reconciliation, international connections of Quakers to do that. And then I've already mentioned the Precarious action and kind of how that was there. After that, in southeastern Connecticut, at the end of it, they said, we've done some really good things here at the end of the summer, right? The training, and they've been doing a lot of demonstrations. But the electric boat workers kept saying, you know, we disarm. We're not really into unilateral disarmament, so go tell it to the Russians. So you know what they did? They went and told it to the Russians. They organized within 3 months a San Francisco to Moscow walk that took 9 months to do. So they walked across this country. They got on a boat. They got kicked out of France because France was a nuclear country doing atmospheric testing. And thanks to A.J. Musty, who had made connections, they actually made it into Red Square in Moscow. And there's a picture of them here. I can't remember which, but there's a picture of that. And that was mostly the Community for Nonviolent Action. At the end of that, some of the people said, we have to stop like going around doing, you know, summer campaigns and then leaving. And so they stayed. And it's one of the reasons I live in that area, because they stayed and they founded the New England Community for Nonviolent Action, which is where I ended up moving from Lower East Side and doing work at WRL to doing that. But I think one of the points here, and maybe the last one I'll make is because I want to mention Barbara again, is Barbara's work on Precarious action, and then the work she did in her writings, and then her involvement with the Women's Pentagon Action and her writing for that, and women reading so many women new to, who are not Vietnam era, but a bit younger, getting involved in that. And then some of those women beginning to get involved in ACT UP. And when they first went to ACT UP, kind of going, I don't know, there's a little chaos here. They don't really have a kind of direct action strategy. But I know that that's possible. And Jamie Bauer went to the War Resisters League office when they were on their way to an ACT UP meeting and said to David McReynolds, can you come with me so we can talk to them about nonviolence action, nonviolence training, affinity groups, and that kind of thing. And so ACT UP used that model because of Barbara, because of the Women's Pentagon Action, because David and Jamie were active in encouraging them to do that. And then that's like the pebble in the water, right? Then that just keeps growing. And I think that the other thing that's really important for us to know now as we do this is the role of the international connections, and that's up there. But as soon as Trump was elected, I started looking at what we've learned from Chile under the Pinochet regime and the amazing work of nonviolence that the folks did there in the kinds of actions that they did. And what did they do in South Africa? And what have they done? Where's the draft resistance? How do we learn from those kinds of things? I think I want to say a few more things here before we get into. I also just want to point out that there are some things this week that can give us hope. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, after how many months, is home with his family, right? We don't know for how long, but he's home with his family. Indiana stood up to gerrymandering, right? Again, I think that it's because of the grassroots. It's also because of the good work some of the media is doing. We're not giving it too much credit there, but there is some of that. I think the other thing is that, I'm sure everybody is aware of the 6 congresspeople who stood up and said, don't follow illegal orders. And we were talking about that this morning. And there's been a group of kind of folks who have done support for GIs, doing a kind of GI resistance huddle for about a year now. A number of organizations like About Face used to be Iraq Vets Against the War, Center on Conscience in War, GI Resistance, War Resisters League, Military Law Task Force. There's a lot of us who have been doing this together for decades, right, who have kind of created some, like the GI Rights Hotline, created that during the Iraq-Afghanistan War. And so people who have been trained in counseling, people who are getting calls from folks in DC or from somebody who isn't directly involved but is very concerned about what's happening in the Caribbean and really wants that stopped and does not want to be part of that at all, right? So just to remember that it's not just Mark Kelly who says it, but it's the people who have kind of, and many went in under an economic conscription, right? Can't get another job, need money for college, or this is the best gig for me. And there's a lot of nonviolence training going on. And some of that we even see. Every Monday, Rachel Maddow kind of does a whole list. And she's got training. She's like, in South Carolina, they were, many churches packed with people. And they were out there doing role plays, and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot we have to do in facing this authoritarian playbook, right? They want us to be feeling like we're in chaos. They want us to they're scapegoating vulnerable communities, they're spreading disinformation, they're, creating this us and them, here are the evil folks. So I want to end with kind of looking at nonviolence, because I think too often we think of nonviolence as just training for nonviolent direct action or being nice or whatever. So this is from a brochure that's in the back, but just to kind of point out, so our way of looking at the basics of radical nonviolence. One is to look at the ends and the means. Nonviolence is rooted in the understanding that ends and means are fundamentally linked and inseparable. We cannot use war, violence, injustice to achieve a world without war, violence, and injustice. And also, like what Barbara Deming said, it's about the systems, not the individuals. Nonviolence recognizes that systems, institutions, and injustice must be overcome, not individuals. Individuals are committing injustice, need to be confronted, held accountable, and compelled to change, or at least isolating them. But harming individuals only perpetuates the cycle of violence. The other is to kind of look at the nature of power. Top-down power depends on obedience, consent, and cooperation. The power of governments is so often so fragile that even a small number, 3.5%, of people disobey or refuse, or people who disobey or refuse to cooperate, the government may be forced to change. I think there's a misunderstanding. How many people have heard that 3.5%? It's been talked about a lot more lately. I think Indivisible is talking about it. Let's just be clear. It just doesn't mean that if 10 million of us go out at the next No Kings demonstration, we've won, right? When we talk about this, this is 3.5% of the people who find a way to resist seriously in some ways. We go out the Europeans and Latin Americans think, wait a minute, like we have a crisis and we get out on the streets and we stay there. You have a crisis and you call for demonstration 2 months down the road, and then you go home and watch yourself on TV, right? That was what Arundhati Roy said about the big February 15th demonstration to stop the war in Iraq. Everybody went home, But in what ways can we, and that is our challenge, what ways can we force corporations, don't pay our taxes, do lots of different things that kind of add to that 3.5. In conflict and struggle, those who most benefit from systems of power are often unwilling to give up privilege without a struggle. Nonviolent activists struggle against systems of oppression within ourselves and our communities and within and among nation states. The other is what Greta said. How do we build new societies in the shell of the old, right? What else can we do? A lot of people are not going to get involved in the resistance, but are getting involved in creating things that the government can't take from us. When Trump was first elected, I started working pretty seriously. I'd been trying to get this going on a community land trust. 7 years later, we have 7 properties, we have community facilities, houses, 15-acre farm. The government can't take that from us and so there's a handbook out there on new worlds and old shells, of kind of what different ways can we do that? Because a lot more people are drawn to creating something rather than, and it all needs to happen. So thank you for listening.